second class, our second class in this series on transcending our limitations, how we work with these 6 perfections. Again, I'm trying to do my best to keep it very, very practical. Obviously, there's some information to give, but really it's about helping each of us to engage in these as best as we can. Of course, recognizing that we don't have the perfection of these yet by any means, but that's what we practice until eventually they are perfected. So let's go ahead and begin as usual with just a few prayers. So I need to do the screen share. Let's see. Still need to be.
I have the prayers that I could share as well, Don.
Okay. Yeah, I'll need to share the slideshow at some point too, though. But anyway, if you
I need to make you co-host, right?
Yeah, and then I can share.
Okay. Now you're good.
There, yeah, I do see it change. The little things changed on my menu. All right, let's go ahead and recite the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha 3 times. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. And we'll do the short mandala offering prayer. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And then finally, before we begin, we'll do the Refuge and Bodhichitta prayer, bringing to mind these 2 thoughts as we recite it first in English together and then in the Tibetan twice. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyan gi pe sonam gi dola penchir sangye drupar sho Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyan gipe sonam gi dola penchir sangye drupar sho. All right, let's do just a short meditation before we begin. As usual, just spend a few minutes focusing on the breath, trying to make the mind very focused, calm, centered. And then also we'll set our motivation together after that. So I'll ring the bell to begin the silent period of meditation, and then I'll come in a few minutes. Now let's take a moment to generate bodhicitta motivation as best as we can, sort of recognizing again that we're not yet bodhisattvas. We're not yet beings who have this in an uncontrived state where bodhicitta can arise spontaneously. But nonetheless, we've all had instruction in how to cultivate this mind, how to look upon sentient beings as having been very dear to us, our kind mothers, fathers, loved ones, and the kindness that they have shown us, and our wish to benefit them, to repay that kindness, and the recognition that the best way to repay that kindness is by helping them to have the happiness they seek, to be free of the suffering that they experience. And we have to have the willingness, the courage to take this on ourselves. If need be, we will do whatever it takes to help beings in this way. And therefore, we have to become enlightened to accomplish that task. If we are ever to help others perfectly, we have to perfect ourselves. So every time that we turn our minds towards these sorts of thoughts that support the development of bodhicitta, we are moving closer and closer to that arrival of that spontaneous mind of bodhicitta, our own becoming bodhisattvas, and then progressing on the path that will lead to our own Buddhahood. But it's important that we do this frequently, especially as we're doing right now, prior to engaging in the Dharma. Because this is how we make our minds familiar with that concept, so that it ends up influencing not just the time we spend together here looking at the Dharma, but our entire lives, and even beyond this life, to all of our future existences, until, again, it becomes this uncontrived mind, and we enter the path formally, and we move towards enlightenment much more quickly. So really relishing the opportunity to cultivate bodhicitta and to hold that thought right now for the duration of this class, as well as this day, this week, this month, this life, and beyond. The sincere desire to become a Buddha for the sake of others. And think that this is why we are here together, to continue our exploration of the six perfections. Okay, good. So in the first class last week, I talked a little bit about the six perfections in general. Again, recall that these are the case of giving the name of the result to the cause. So we don't have the perfection of all of these really, or the perfect mind that is imbued with all these qualities until we reach Buddhahood. But nonetheless, we practice them now, even before entering the path, as a means of planting the seeds that will ripen into the full state of enlightenment, where we will have these perfected qualities. And also recall that last week I did talk a little bit about how they are set out in an even more increasing in difficulty order kind of thing, so that we look at the list of these six, we see that the very first one that we talked about last week, generosity, is said to be the easiest to practice, though there are obviously challenges within generosity that may be hard. And then ethics, which we're going to go on to tonight, is said to be a little bit more difficult. And then patience, even more so, joyous effort, concentration, wisdom, all increasing in their difficulty. So again, we'll progress through these as we go through the remaining sessions in this course. But tonight is to look at this idea of ethics. We're going to talk a little bit about ethics, or morality, sometimes called, or sometimes ethical discipline. They throw in that word discipline, that I think is a bit of a difficult word in our culture. You know, people don't like to hear, "Oh, you have to be more disciplined." Well, like, what do you mean? I want to be a free spirit. I want to do whatever I need to do and not be so disciplined. But we need discipline. And we need, in last night's class that I was teaching for the West Coast, the Exploring Buddhism pilot program that I'm doing for them, this idea of discipline and the critical thinking that we have towards ourselves often that is entailed in that came up. And I talked about how we need a sort of self-compassionate or a compassionate discipline with the self-compassion that really sees what is ideal for us. That's actually where the teachings on ethics start in the Lam Rim. Kind of want to point out the fact that I find it interesting that this topic we're looking at tonight is actually taught in all three levels of the Lam Rim. In the very first level, where the main motivation is to get a good rebirth, well, we have to practice ethical discipline in order to gain the causes for a good rebirth. If we don't practice morality, we don't plant the seeds for a good rebirth, as well as a lot of our other ethical behavior results in good conditions within that existence. So all the good things we have in our lives now came from virtuous behavior, virtuous things we did in the past, how we disciplined ourselves to engage in those and to not engage in the opposite. So that's the very first level of the stages of the path, and we see that ethics plays a key role there. When we get to the middle scope, the person of the middling capacity, we see that there too, it's said to be the foundational practice of what are called the three higher trainings. That in order to develop concentration, which is the second training, you need the foundation of morality. And in order to develop wisdom, which is the third higher training, you need the foundation of concentration. So without morality as a basis, you can't have concentration, you can't have wisdom, you can't be liberated. And again, in the middle scope, this is the goal, is to attain one's own liberation from all suffering, not just the unfortunate states that you're trying to avoid in the first level of the stages of the path. Now we get to the Bodhisattva Path, the person of highest capacity, the higher capable being, as Lama Zopa often calls it. This is obviously where we want to be. This is where we want to be practicing our ethical behavior, is with this bigger motivation, that we're not just about engaging in pure ethical behavior for our own benefit, but also for the benefit of others. Also, so that we can accomplish enlightenment, we can develop our minds to a greater degree. So we still use ethics as a sort of foundation. But moreover, we will be in the best position to benefit them because we have ceased harming them out of compassion for them. And we have also begun to benefit them as best as we can because we're concerned about their welfare. So the Bodhisattva path takes on another dimension of ethical behavior. The first one to get a good rebirth, the middle scope to get, liberated, to have the causes to free oneself from suffering. And then we finally get to the great scope. We see that this is where there's this even greater dimension to why we want to engage in ethical discipline. So we have to see it in regard to us being, again, this is something we do for ourselves, but in the Mahayana, we also are doing it for others. If we don't practice good ethical discipline, we'll never see the fruits that we are enjoying right now in this very life. In the future, we will be separated from those if we don't do that. Moreover, we won't be again in the best position to benefit other beings. So I've put together a few slides for tonight. Let me move into the perfection of ethics. We're just going to call it ethics. Some texts will call it morality. I think that's what it is in Lama Zopa's book that I mentioned last week is a nice little companion to this. We're going to talk about the definition of it and once more highlight, like we did with generosity, that this is mostly a state of mind. It is behavior that follows from that, physically, verbally, what have you. But moreover, it is a state of mind that we want to perfect. And then the types of ethics, look at some of the hindrances to ethics, what are often called sort of the causes of not having that perfect ethical discipline. And then some of the benefits of practicing ethics, and then a little bit about how we practice this perfection, how we engage in it. But hopefully as we go through this, a lot of this will unfold for us. We are going to be touching on a number of topics that many of us have seen before, including karma and, avoiding the 10 non-virtuous actions, what have you. But take that review as a way of, again, remembering and recalling how important ethical behavior is once more, right from the very beginning of our path. So the definition that is given by, and this is Geshe Loden's contemporary Lamrim book, it says, ethics is the virtuous thought, to abandon both harming others and the thoughts that are the basis of harming them. This is kind of pointing to this whole foundational idea that is behind Buddhist ethics, which is essentially, I think it's the Sanskrit word ahimsa. Ahimsa is essentially non-harmfulness. This is the foundation of all the Buddha's teachings. And recall that when you take refuge, if you do that through ceremony, or even if you, in your own heart, deeply take refuge in the three jewels, one of the precepts in particular, in relation to the Dharma jewel, is to refrain from intentionally harming other beings. That's the essence of the Dharma. Obviously, there are many other teachings in Buddhism, but that really is at the core of all of what Buddhism teaches. His Holiness is renowned for having the quote from him, which says, we have to do our best to help others, but if we cannot help them, at least don't harm them. So we see that this is really a key kind of motivation and idea from the very beginning in Buddhist ethics. And again, we can see it playing out in those various scopes, even when we get to the Mahayana path, where we're trying not to harm others, but we're also, of course, trying to avoid any thoughts that will kind of curtail or delay our own enlightenment, because that's also, in a sense, harming others, because the quicker we become Buddhas, the less time beings will have to spend in samsara. The more Buddhas that there are, the more beings who have connection to other beings that can help them on their path, the less harm will come to them, the less suffering they will have to experience. So even in the Mahayana, when we talk about, again, kind of developing our minds and what have you, and maybe avoiding more of the mental thoughts that are problematic for us, those are also involved in ahimsa, non-harmfulness towards beings, of course, towards ourselves as well, because we suffer from those. But we'll get into this a little bit more as we go through this tonight. But the second part of this is, of course, what we saw with generosity last week. Based on bodhicitta motivation, your practice of ethics will become a perfection of ethics. So the perfection of ethics, again, is always used in the Mahayana context. Together with bodhicitta, this is how we transform our ethical behavior and discipline into the perfection of ethics, because otherwise it's simply a practice of ethics. I mean, many people practice ethical behavior in this world. You don't have to be Buddhist to practice ethical behavior. In fact, His Holiness is a real advocate of what he calls secular ethics, which is simply based on the need to abide with others and to have a means of assuring that the common good is sought within society. So ethics doesn't have to have this bodhicitta motivation, but if it does have it, then it becomes a perfection of ethics. And then, as I said earlier, to see that this is, again, within our minds, it must be understood that the perfection of ethics is the complete development of a state of mind based on bodhicitta that restrains from harming others. It's not the total eradication of harm, just like we saw last week when we looked at the idea of, okay, how do bodhisattvas perfect generosity? Does it mean that they have to satisfy the needs of all beings then? So everyone is satisfied, then they've perfected their generosity. Well, obviously, that can't be the measure, because first of all, I mean, is that possible to even do? But moreover, if it's not done, obviously we still have many beings who are poor, who are bereft of resources, what have you. Well, there are enlightened beings, there are Buddhas who've attained the perfection of generosity without satisfying the needs of all beings. It's the same with regard to all of these perfections. It's not something that is measured on the basis of ceasing all harm to all beings. I mean, it's a lovely idea, right? Wouldn't it be wonderful if there was never any harm done to any other being in any existence, in any world? But of course, this is not possible. But if we perfect our own minds, then we have essentially done the work that is a part of that process of helping all beings to be free from harm. So it's not the total eradication of harm. In fact, Master Shantideva, once more, I quoted from him last week, because in chapter 5 of his text, Bodhicharyavatara, he essentially talks about how all 6 perfections are developed within our minds. So he says in this verse, where will the fish and so forth be driven so that they will not be killed? I mean, where are you going to put everybody so that there's never any beings who are killed, no harm that comes to any beings? We're going to find a safe haven for every single being, all the fish and all the mice and all the ants and all the humans and everyone. Hence, the attainment of the intention of abandonment is explained to be the perfection of ethics. So the intention of abandoning harm to beings is explained to be how we perfect ethics in our own mind, not by getting all beings to a state where they're free of harm, So this is an important point, that we are always working with developing these qualities within our minds. I'm going to go into the types of ethics and essentially introduce them just very briefly with the three that are on the screen now. And there is, again, another handout like I prepared and distributed for last week. But all of them are going to be, I think everything on the handout other than the one thing I'll point out later is in the slides. So I don't know if I'm going to go back and forth between those. I'll just mostly stick with the slides. We have essentially the first type of ethics, which is how we normally think of ethics. And again, we even talked about it the way we were saying, refraining from killing, refraining from harming. This is the ethics of restraint. We want to hold back from engaging in non-virtuous actions. Of course, we will see that there are more than just the 10 non-virtues that are listed. We also can look at our vows and all the things that we don't want to transgress in terms of our behavior in Buddhist tradition. And so this is an important part of our ethics. It's sort of the beginning point. And we see again on the small scope, the person of the least capacity, they have to have some restraint. Remember, Venerable Rabina always describes the ethics of that part of the path as what she learned in kindergarten or very young. Zip your lip and keep your hands to yourself. You refrain. You have this restraint of like, I'm not going to touch other people's stuff and touch them and do all this sorts of things to harm them, and I'm going to keep my mouth shut so I don't say harmful things to them. I don't divide them with my speech and so on. So again, this is where it starts, but it's not the full totality of perfection of ethics because we see that there are two more components. The second one is the ethics of gathering virtuous dharmas, which is obviously the flip side of that, to engage in not just refraining from killing, but to even protect life, for example, or to do things that are beyond just avoiding killing and avoiding stealing. And to do our best to engage in other virtuous deeds, the perfections themselves and what have you, everything that the Buddha sets out that is a way of ripening our own minds. This is actually how Rinpoche in his book calls the second one. He calls it the morality of ripening one's own mind. So this is how we develop our own qualities through virtuous thoughts and the behavior that follows from that. And then we have a third one that is really, again, showing that the Bodhisattva doesn't just, sit in a room and have these wonderful thoughts. We actually want to have an ethics that is related to benefiting living beings, to being a part of freeing them from their suffering in the moment. I know that oftentimes when we, come to the Mahayana path and we look at it, and we see that there is this whole idea of, oh, I can't really benefit others to the greatest degree until I become a Buddha. And we kind of keep saying, well, but then I have to keep putting energy into becoming a Buddha, because if I don't become a Buddha, I can never really benefit others truly. Well, this is not really what the path teaches. That's an extreme, and it's not a very healthy one to be in, to think that I have to wait until I get all the way to the enlightenment and then I can benefit others. No, you can benefit others right now. And many of you are already doing that, right? And the work that you do, behaviors that you have with other people, that you do come to their aid when they need something, or they're in a very difficult situation, or they're sick in bed. You come to their aid and benefit them. This is a key part of our Bodhisattva path, and we shouldn't neglect it. Again, it doesn't mean that there will always be, the occasion for us to do that, and we don't necessarily always want to set aside our Dharma practice. That might be more important to do that. But nonetheless, we have to engage in both of these, developing our own minds, ripening our own qualities, but also being active in the world, helping those who are in dire straits and difficult situations. Because the bodhisattvas are not like, again, those who practice on the Hinayana path, the individual liberation folks who really want to isolate themselves from the world and attain their own freedom from samsara. Bodhisattva wants to be involved in the world, wants to help beings, connect with beings, be among them. There will be times in the Bodhisattva's career where they also need to be isolated in order to deepen their meditative concentration, for example. We'll talk about that when we get to the fifth perfection. But nonetheless, most of a Bodhisattva's behavior is about being with others and to make those connections, to have that very close tie to those beings, so that we can then create some very positive karma with them that will ripen into our ability to help them to even greater degrees in the future. But helping others is a key component. of all this, as we'll see when we go through these in more detail. Let me just show you the little chart so you know it looks very similar to the last one. We're going to have like it's called the mind of ethics. We have types of ethics, which are the three we're going to go through now. And then we have on the second page, these ways to practice ethics for the best and purest results, which I alluded to a little bit. There was some different points on the one for generosity, but I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. And if I've got some time, go through a few of those, because those are the ways for each of these perfections that we can make them into something really, really powerful. Because again, this is part of creating the causes for our enlightenment, creating the causes to be able to benefit others to even greater degrees. So let's look at these individually using the slides that I had put together when I taught this, I think earlier this year, I think it was, in the beginning of 2020 or end of last year, I can't remember, or 2021 or the end of last year. I can't remember exactly when I did that course for TNL. Ethics of restraint is described as to restrain body, speech, and mind from non-virtue. Now, body and speech are the physical and verbal manifestations of what's going on in the mind. And as we saw just a few slides ago, we're working on perfecting this in our mind. If we've developed the very deep intention to never harm others, then it will play out in how we are physically with them, how we are verbally with them. But this is all included within restraint, because we do initially at least have to have some physical restraint, keep our hands to ourselves, as Venerable Robina said, and zip our lip, so that we don't engage in harmful speech towards others. But it all comes from our minds. And the mind is the most important thing, obviously, to really change and to develop that intention. So in terms of the divisions of this, we see that the key part of it is the fundamental level of the practice of ethics is to avoid the 10 non-virtues. This is part of a bodhisattva's ethic as well, because the 10 non-virtues are the way that the Buddha spelled out in terms of a very concise list, the main things that we currently get involved in and that we need to avoid if we are ever to have that foundational practice. The next level of practice is to avoid both what are often referred to as natural negativities or natural misdeeds, and negativities by decree or prescribed negativities or deeds, misdeeds, by engaging in the various levels of vowed restraint. So when we take vows, let's look at I'm going to talk about vows a little bit later, but let's begin with just the very first vow of the 5 lay vows that many of you have taken. The first one is the vow of not killing. And of course, this means to not intentionally take the life of another being, period. Whether it's human or non-human, you want to do your best to avoid that intentional taking of a life. Well, that is a natural misdeed too, because it's among the 10 non-virtues, right? We're going to be looking at them in a second in a brief way. I won't go into all the detail that we do when we normally go through this in a Lam Rim course. But that's, natural misdeed. It is naturally non-virtuous to take the life of a being. Now, again, there are those rare instances where the Buddha as a bodhisattva, as the ship captain, took the life of the one man who was going to take the lives of all the other people on the ship. And it became more virtuous by way of the motivation that he had of compassion for everyone involved, especially the person who was going to kill all of those beings whose life he took. So these actions can be modified to some degree or ameliorated by the motivation that we have. But nonetheless, they in and of themselves are non-virtuous. They are natural misdeeds. If we look at the 5th of the lay vows, it's to refrain from alcohol and intoxicants. These are not natural misdeeds. There's nothing sort of within the act of drinking a glass of wine that is non-virtuous. It's influenced, of course, by our state of mind and by what we do. We could make it very non-virtuous depending upon that, but it doesn't have that flavor in and of itself. It's not a non-virtuous action. However, it's prescribed. It is by decree that the Buddha decided it was good to have this vow. And when people take that vow, they then have to uphold that vow by not engaging in alcohol and intoxicants, because they have committed to doing that, and they are going to go along with that prescribed, avoiding that prescribed misdeed. Whereas again, killing is a natural misdeed, and we can, also take the vow not to kill. But nonetheless, when it comes to some of these things, and many of the monastic vows, as I understand them, I don't know them all because I've never been ordained, such as not trimming trees and not digging in the ground and what have you. Well, certainly you can kill some beings and harm some beings with some of these actions, but they're not in and of themselves non-virtuous. Otherwise, everyone who's a gardener would be like condemned to eons in hell realms or what have you, because all they're doing is digging in dirt and trimming the branches of trees and what have you. So again, know that within the vows, there are both of those. Sometimes there are natural misdeeds that one has to refrain from. And then sometimes there are prescribed misdeeds, or what's the word for it? There's another word that's used sometimes. I want to say specified, but there's something like that anyway. The idea is that the Buddha said that these are good things to avoid because they help to support other ethical behavior. Because recall why they often say the fifth vow is included, why it's good to also refrain from intoxicants is because it becomes a doorway often to engaging in more non-virtue. That once you've had a few too many drinks, or you're a little bit more inebriated, then the guard goes down, all sorts of stuff happens, what have you. So let's take a look at these 10 non-virtues that are the foundation of our behavior, our ethical behavior, that are even, again, part of the Bodhisattva's path, without a doubt, though they are done with Bodhichitta motivation. The 3 actions of the body that we want to refrain from. Killing is said to be the worst of these 3. Stealing next worst, and then unwise sexual behavior the third. But obviously there are circumstances that might make one worse than the other, depending upon the various factors involved. So again, I don't want to belabor any of these because I'm guessing that every one of us has had numerous teachings on these. But just to recall that killing is where we do take the life of any being, and we do it with the intention to do so, to the motivation of taking their life, killing them. We also do it with a delusion, obviously, and with a recognition that that's the being that we want to kill. Actually, let me go forward a few slides when we get to that. These are the 4 components of a complete non-virtuous action. So again, with killing, there's the basis, a being. And the mental state that's involved is we have to recognize that that's the being that we want to kill. We have to have the motive to kill them and a delusion to kill them. So I like to use the example of a mosquito. We're not in mosquito season right now, but if you have a mosquito that lands on your hand and you recognize it then as being a mosquito, and you say, I'm going to kill that mosquito, and you're doing it out of attachment to your body because you don't want that mosquito to suck your blood and to leave behind this welt and what have you, that can become kind of annoying and painful perhaps. So that's your first two factors. The third is you have to engage in the deed. You have to actually, raise your hand and go to smash the mosquito. And then the completion is when the mosquito is dead. They often say that you die, the being dies before you die. That's kind of an interesting thing, but it seems that if you are dead before the being dies, then you can't really collect the karma of its death, that completion, because you're not there as a being at that point. But the idea is that these are the 4 components that make this act of killing, and we're not going to go through it with all of these, but they make the act of killing very powerful, because once the act is complete, then we can have all 4 results. And let's actually go ahead and take a look at those results and talk a little bit about what they are for killing. The ripened result for any of these that are complete, any of the non-virtues, is to take rebirth in one of the unfortunate states, where we will not only have to experience the suffering in those states, but we will also be blocked from doing much that is meaningful with our lives, because the conditions will be so antithetical to a spiritual path. Then we have 2 that are results similar to the cause. One in terms of our experience, meaning that there is something that happens to us that is similar to what we did to others. In this case, if we killed others, then we have some diminishment in our own life in terms of having many illnesses, bad health throughout our lives, many troubles, little energy, having obstacles to our success in this life. And then the third one is results similar to the cause in terms of our actions or behavior, which means that we'll have the tendency to kill again. the habitual desire to take the lives of others and harm them. So those two are similar to the cause because they have a mirror image to some degree of what we did, in this case, killing. So therefore we would continue killing and moreover have some harm to our own physical well-being because we've harmed that of others. And then fourth, the environmental results. And for killing, it's taking birth in a place where there's a lot of violence and war, many problems, maybe even, again, scarcity of resources, or the resources have little power. They're always inferior. We have difficulty with disease in our world, what have you. We can say that to some degree, what we're experiencing in terms of the pandemic is a manifestation of killing karma that is engaged in on a more collective basis in this world. Okay, so then that's those things that, again, are going to come back around to in a moment, but let's go back through the actions that are also in the category of physical actions, those done with the body: stealing, taking the resources of another that do not belong to you and were not offered to you; unwise sexual behavior, which is mostly engaging in adultery, having relationships outside a committed relationship that one is in, or with someone who we know is in a committed relationship if we aren't in one ourselves. And then any other coerced sexual behavior, sexual abuse of those sorts would obviously fall into that same category. Those are the main ones that are covered in terms of our body, how we use our body unskillfully. Lying, divisive speech, harsh speech, meaningless speech, these are set out once more, the worst being lying, supposedly, though we can do a lot of damage with the others. Lying, of course, is saying something we know to be untrue to someone else, wanting to deceive them. And it can be done not just when we use speech here, in our day and age where we have so many other ways of communicating. In fact, I had somebody earlier today say to me, well, we could talk on the phone, but we could also do this by text if you'd like. And I just despise texting. It's a younger person than me, obviously. But, I know some people really get into texting and they just love to have like a whole conversation on the phone. And I'm sorry, I'd really like to just talk to you. But any way that we communicate to others is speech. If you use semaphore, that could be unskillful speech. If you lie to others through semaphore, if you lie to others through texting, through emailing, and it goes for the other ones of speech as well. And then, of course, we have divisive speech after that, which is when we try to put a wedge between people where there wasn't one, or further the wedge when there already was one. And that can be two people, but that can be like Republicans and Democrats. That can be, African Americans and white Americans. It can be whatever. We can do that through any speech that is intended to create a further divide or to divide people that haven't been divided. And then harsh speech, where we use our speech as a weapon to try to harm others through the very loud, negative, sharp, maybe even obscene things we might say to somebody that are really cutting very hard for people to hear those words. And then finally, the last one, which is said to be the least, but it's the one that we perhaps engage in more frequently, our meaningless chatter, our meaningless talk. All the times that we spend just totally attached to going on for hours and hours about things that don't really matter. Again, we do have to engage in some level of chit chat with others, to have some connection with them, to warm up to them, to be in their presence and what have you. But if that's what we're doing totally, is just spending a whole night talking about things that really don't matter, we've wasted our own time, but moreover, we've wasted others' time. So those are the ones of speech that we want to avoid. And then finally, the three of mind, which again, with those of mind, we might not think, well, I'm not really directly harming others through these, but we are harming others in terms of the behavior that might follow. But moreover, if we keep following these minds, we're going to end up doing damage to others by our inability to benefit them. That's the Bodhisattva perspective I mentioned earlier tonight. So covetousness is said to be the least of these three, and wrong view the worst. But covetousness is that mind of craving that is continually looking to acquire things, what other people own or businesses own, what you see on websites, and you want to obtain those. Whether you obtain them or not isn't what makes this complete. It's when you get to that point where you say, I think I'm going to go for that. I really want that. And you again, do whatever you can to acquire it. And sometimes you steal it, other times you gain it through an exchange, giving money for something. But that mind that is constantly seeking to acquire things is a problematic mind. Malice or ill will is where we have a desire to harm someone, and we get to a place where we decide that we are going to harm them. And whether or not we actually do that physically or verbally isn't the point. That's not what makes it complete. It's when we have that mind that ripens into wanting to harm. And then wrong view, and the worst wrong view being the denial of karma, the law of cause and effect that we're discussing here, that will give you carte blanche to do whatever you want then. Because if karma doesn't exist and there are no consequences to our actions, then we can do whatever we want and harm whoever we wish, what have you. So those three of mine often become the springboard to go into the other behaviors that we talked about. But they can be complete karmas in and of themselves as mental thoughts that get to these set points of wanting to acquire, wanting to harm, denying a particular thing that the Buddha says exists, or even establishing something in your own mind that the Buddha says doesn't exist. So again, all of them have these four factors that can make them into a complete non-virtuous action. If they are lacking any one of these, they do not become complete. And of course, if they're lacking a good portion of them, they become much weaker karmas, much weaker mental actions. And here I'm talking about them mostly from a non-virtuous perspective. But recall that these do apply when it comes to the virtuous actions that we're going to get into later. And then if they are complete, they can have all four results. They can ripen into an actual rebirth, create the causes similar in terms of what you experience in a rebirth, and then also what you experience in terms of your own behavior and actions, and even, again, influence the environment that we are born into and that we live in. That's the main category. As I said, the other side of it was this idea of vows. And I'm just going to talk very briefly about vows. Recall that in Buddhism, we have three levels of vows. And within the first level, which is often referred to as pratimoksha, individual liberation, we have a variety of sets. Some of them pertain to actual ordination, where one becomes a monk or nun and abides by various levels, depending upon whether you're just a sort of probationary monk or nun, and then a novice, and then, of course, the fully ordained. And so the fully ordained has a number of vows, but those vows are there for a reason, and particularly around ordained behavior, to give a very tight focus as to what it is that one is to engage in as an ordained person. But even in regard to the 5 lay vows that are part of the pratimoksha vows, they also help us to delineate our behavior. I like to look at vows, whether we talk about this level or bodhisattva vows or tantric vows, through that lens, that they are kind of cordoning off our path for us so that we know very clearly what we have to abide by and what we have to reinforce in our behavior so that we get to the result that we want to go to. They're not meant to be seen as some sort of burden. Oh no, I've taken these vows. Now I've got to live my life with all these things hanging over my head. It's rather something we should be really joyful about having in our lives because, as I said, they delineate exactly what we need to do. Avoid this, do that. They help us give the prescriptions and proscriptions of how we go about attaining the goals that we seek, whether it be liberation, which is what the individual liberation vows are about, pratimoksha, or whether it be enlightenment, which is what bodhisattva vows are about. And then, of course, if you do take highest yoga tantra empowerment, then you take the tantric vows, which are, again, to reinforce the behavior that we engage in the tantric path. That is a quick way of attaining enlightenment. So if we take those vows, we should feel somewhat prepared to be able to do that, but it doesn't mean we're going to hold them perfectly. There are techniques to purify transgressions, as we know, through the 4 opponent powers and what have you, which I won't be going into. But know that this is an important part of this first level of ethical behavior, to refrain, to restrain ourselves from transgressing our vows. Not just to refrain from doing the 10 non-virtuous actions, which is good to start with, but when we take those vows, to take them seriously, to become familiar with them and what it means to break them, what it means to transgress them, and then to uphold them as best as we can, recognizing that we're not going to be perfect in our behavior. The second type is the ethics of gathering virtuous dharmas. As I mentioned, Rinpoche calls this ripening one's own mind. And this is to engage in the accumulation of virtue, which ensures that you do not harm others. It kind of keeps you in that place of a virtuous state of mind so that your intentions will follow from that, and the behavior that you engage in will be a product of that virtue. So this includes, as it says there, all virtuous actions, such as the 6 perfections themselves, the 10 virtuous actions, which, as I said, are not just not killing and not stealing, they're more than that. And then the practices of renunciation, bodhicitta, wisdom, and so on, all the various things we engage in on the path. So let me talk a little bit about what constitutes one of the 10 virtuous actions. As I alluded to this already earlier tonight, but and actually, there's a wonderful footnote. Maybe I'll even read from that in, again, Lama Zopa's book on the 6 perfections, where he essentially says this is what we mean by the 10 virtuous actions. It's on page 189. So the 10 virtues are, in regard to the 10 that we just looked at, the renouncing killing, that's the first part of it, and protecting the lives of others. So again, when we take on a more virtuous behavior, it doesn't mean just not killing, because every one of you right now is not killing, right? I don't think you're killing anything. I hope you're not killing anything while you're listening to me teach, but you're not killing. So you're refraining from killing. So it's not simple the refraining from doing that act. It means that you are also, moreover, doing what you can to protect life. That if you see an insect that's struggling in water, or you see birds that haven't eaten in a while and you decide you're going to feed them, you do whatever you can to support life, to protect life, to not allow others to lose their lives. Then I'll just read through the other ones real quickly. Renouncing stealing and practicing generosity, which is the giving of our own resources to others. Renouncing sexual misconduct and being faithful to our partners and what have you. Renouncing lying and committing to telling the truth. Renouncing harsh words, so you've got them in a little bit different order, and speaking gently. Renouncing divisive speech and working towards harmony, doing what we can to promote harmony in our world and in our friendships, our circles of beings. Renouncing idle gossip, meaningless speech, and speaking meaningfully, trying to make sure that we have good intention and good content to the way that we talk to others and how we engage in speech with them. Then the last 3 of mind, renouncing covetousness and rejoicing in the fortune of others. So not always looking at trying to acquire more and things, but be content by just taking delight in what others have and their good fortune and what have you, and not always needing that for ourselves. The 9th one, renouncing ill will and wishing well of others. This is kind of like that 4th generosity we talked about last week, the giving of love, wanting others to have good positive qualities, happiness in their lives, what have you. And then lastly, renouncing heresy or wrong view and seeking the right view. So it's kind of a nice little concise way of looking at what we mean by those 10 virtuous actions. It's not simply refraining from the 10 non-virtues. It's actually doing what we can to take them in a whole nother direction, to be about protecting life in this world, protecting the possessions of others, and even being willing to share our own possessions and so on. Then in terms of the other behaviors, we see that they're mostly about, once more, accumulating virtue, though we also look to reduce the negative tendencies and to purify our minds. But we're really about creating a store, the merits that we need to further our path. That's the second of these types of ethics. And then another grouping of virtues is the practice of what are called the 11 virtuous mental factors. Some of you have studied the mental factors, and if you came to the Exploring the Mind, the first of the pilot modules that I'm doing on exploring Buddhism, we looked at them very briefly. This is the list of the 11. Oops, there we go. Faith, self-respect, consideration for others. We're going to talk about some of these a little bit later tonight. Non-attachment, non-hatred, non-ignorance, which again are not just having no attachment in our minds. It's actually developing a mind that understands all of that and embraces kind of a more virtuous stance towards the things in our lives, the possessions, what have you. Not just having an absence of hatred, but engaging in loving kindness towards others. And again, not just an absence of ignorance, but a mind that is imbued with wisdom. And then the effort, pliancy, conscientiousness, equanimity. A lot of these, especially effort, pliancy, and equanimity, are talked about when we get to concentration, the fifth perfection. But these are all, and of course, non-harmfulness, I mentioned earlier, ahimsa, this wonderful basis for all of the Buddhist ethics, Buddhist morality. These are all positive states of mind that we should be doing our best to cultivate as much as we can. And again, I'll talk about a few of these later. I don't want to go into really deep detail on all of these, but anytime we cultivate a virtuous mental factor, it influences the content of our mind. Let's talk just a little bit about that first one, faith, because faith is an interesting one. I have a little class I've done sometimes as a standalone period of talking about faith in the Buddhist path, because faith doesn't have the same connotation as faith does in Judeo-Christian traditions, for example, at least my experience with faith growing up Catholic. There, it was a bit more of a blind faith to some degree. It had some of the same components in terms of having a conviction in what one is to have this belief and confidence in, this faith in. But it was still had a lot of elements of blind faith, a lot of elements of needing to extend myself to something that I couldn't experience or have some sort of reasoning through it and what have you. And in Buddhism, faith has three dimensions to it, actually. It starts off as what was often, this is at least how I present them, sometimes they're presented in a slightly different order, as a clear faith, where we get some clarity through learning the teachings like we're doing tonight, or like we've done in the past, all the teachings we've attended, books that we've read, and so on. It gains some clarity that some faith is already stimulated within us, that we look at this as something we can have some confidence on because what we're reading and what we're learning about makes some sense. It has some sort of lucid quality to it. Then secondly, we have a faith of aspiration, which actually encourages us to move in that direction. It's a faith that isn't content with just seeing it all clearly, but wanting to move in the direction of actualizing these qualities in our own mind. And then we have a faith that arises from our own conviction, faith of confidence, you might even call it, where through our own experience, we become convinced that this is the path, that this is what we need to do. And our faith becomes even stronger. And I like to present them in that way because that's how I've seen it act in my own life, is that when you gain some deeper trust in the Dharma through your own experience of it, then you have much more positive regard for the Dharma and you engage in the Dharma much more easily. That's the mental factor of faith that facilitates that whole process of your active engagement in the Buddha's teachings. It's a wonderful quality, a virtuous quality to have. And so, again, it's good to cultivate those 11 virtuous mental factors as frequently as we can. Again, talk a little bit about a few of them later tonight. That's the second of these three types, the ethics of engaging in the virtuous dharmas or virtuous behavior, or as Rinpoche says, ripening one's own mind. As I said, this last one shows the real bodhisattva orientation towards our ethical behavior, the ethics of benefiting living beings. This means by actively engaging in deeds to help others, you are naturally restrained from harming. Because if you're benefiting them, then hopefully you don't harm them, at least not intentionally. You know, sometimes we might be trying to let an insect out of our house in the summer where we know it's just going to die from being trapped in our house, and it can have a nice little happy life outside. And we might not do that as skillfully. So we might harm it in the process. But if we have a good motivation and at least try to be as skillful as we can, we won't harm another being. We won't be doing that because we're trying to help them. We're trying to benefit them through our behavior. Divisions of this are any virtuous action performed to benefit other living beings. Once more, we can include the practice of the six perfections, maintaining our vows, because those do benefit others. Even though many of them are working on ourselves and refraining from these things, others might be the beneficiary because we refrain from harming them, but also they become the beneficiary because we will become enlightened out of those practices to be able to benefit them to even greater degrees in the state of Buddhahood. But specifically, as it says there are 11 ways to conduct yourself in relation to helping others. It's kind of interesting. There's the 11 virtuous mental factors I just went through, and now these 11 ways that we can benefit others. But I'm not going to go into, again, every one of these, but these give some idea of who should be within our field of concern, which essentially covers almost everybody. Helping those who suffer or are suffering in the moment, whether they be ill or dealing with poverty or what have you. Helping those ignorant of the methods, they don't know the methods of the Dharma, how to get happiness, how to avoid suffering. Benefiting those in need of help, who are dealing with some danger. Well, that's the next one, protecting those in danger, but those in need of help would be like travelers coming through that need to know where to stay or how to find this or whatever. Even just giving directions to a stranger is those in need of help. Helping those, again, protecting those in danger, anyone who is dealing with something that might endanger their own lives or well-being or resources. Helping those afflicted with misery. Sounds like a lot of people included in that one, but anyone who's grieving, who's dealing with any miserable state of mind, we want to do our best to benefit them. Helping the poverty-stricken, those who have more, again, manifest being bereft of resources, those sorts of things, not having what one needs even for one's well-being, livelihood. Number 7, helping the homeless. Number 8, helping others according to their wishes. Of course, we don't do everything that others wish, but if they have wishes that we can fulfill and that are ethical to fulfill, then we do what we can to benefit them. Helping those on the right path, those who are practitioners like ourselves who need some aid in continuing their spiritual development, and helping those on the wrong path, which is to try to help them that if they are moving in the opposite direction towards unfavorable rebirths, we try to do what we can to get them to correct their path. And helping others using miracles, which is when we do have, if we develop our minds further through deeper states of concentration, we develop some sort of supernatural abilities to be able to do certain things that do come by the way on some of these, when we develop some of these deeper states of concentration. If we don't use those to benefit others, then that is said to be, again, overlooking what we can possibly do that will help others in the moment. I mean, I find it kind of interesting when you look at all of these, it's a matter of, once more, we are not going to, I don't think, I mean, from my own experience, be able to help everyone all the time. I think this would be kind of an unrealistic expectation. But when we have something that comes into our sphere of experience and we have the opportunity to help, we should always be willing to do that in whatever way we can. Venerable Rabina, when she taught on, I don't know if it was, I can't remember what the exact class was about, but she said, I think it was on the one on generosity that I quoted from her last week, where she was talking about writing your checks to the utility companies, even make that an act of generosity. But what she was saying in this one was, she said, if there's a homeless person coming down the street and they come up to you, they make eye contact with you and they go, please, I need $1 or $2 if you can spare it. Don't think that that's not your homeless person. Don't think, oh, that's someone else's homeless person. The people that they're going to run into down the street, they can take care of that homeless person. That's your homeless person. Always want to have that attitude of whoever comes into our life that needs help, that is in a difficult situation, is grieving, what have you, that's our person that's we've got some sort of karma with, that's coming to us and seeking some aid, some benefit from us. We should be willing to open our hearts to doing something for them. If we can't physically give them anything, maybe we didn't put any money in our, wallet or pockets or whatever before we left the house, and we go, oh no, I don't have anything to give you. I'm sorry, maybe you've got a credit card or something, and you say, well, could I take you to the Starbucks and get you a cup of coffee? Or could I, take you to this place and buy you a lunch? If you can do that, great. But even if you can't do something for them in the moment, if you know that you can't stop, you can't really be a part of that, at least send them some positive thoughts. At least give them some goodwill by being nice to them, kind to them, not just neglecting them and treating them as if they don't matter. To do whatever we can to benefit others. Obviously, you could spend your whole life trying to relieve all of these things, but recall, as we said with generosity, and as we just said tonight with ethics, it's not about perfecting things on the external. It's not about freeing all beings from harm or making sure all beings have the resources they need. We do what we can in regard to that, which is a reflection of our own internal development. But the internal development is more important in the end. But if it doesn't manifest in external behavior, there is a disconnect. Like I said last week, if we think, oh, I've got a really good intention to give, but then when somebody asks for something, we go, no, I can't give you anything. Well, then there's a disconnect. It's the same with our ethical behavior. We want to have this intention to benefit others, but if it doesn't manifest in our actual benefit when we're confronted with a situation, then there's a gap. And it's okay if that gap is there and we recognize it, but don't think that that's okay. We want to keep moving to close that gap so that when somebody comes into our life and they say, I really could use some support right now. I just went through a difficult situation and maybe just got out of the hospital and I need somebody to get groceries for me on a weekly basis. Would you be willing to do that? If you honestly have a schedule where you cannot do that, well, then maybe you have to say that. But don't write that person off. Say, well, I'd really like to help you. Maybe I could do that once a month. Or maybe I could help find somebody that could help you with that. Would that be okay? Don't just leave it as a simple no and slam the door. We have to do what we can to keep those connections going, to try to benefit others as best as we can. But as I said, we're not going to be able to alleviate the suffering and the harm that is going on in our world around us with regard to every single being. And you could spend your life consumed with that. And that may be of great merit to some people to do that. Mother Teresa, amazing being, right? She's dedicated her whole life to helping people on the streets of Calcutta, to doing what she could to alleviate some of the worst suffering that existed on our planet at that time, at least in the human realm. Unbelievable poverty and what have you, illness. So great, if you can do that and you want to dedicate your life in that way, do it with bodhicitta and you'll probably accumulate tons of merit. But there's a lot of us, again, that we're doing other things. We're helping out with the center and we're doing various things to other parts of our Dharma practice and what have you. It's not going to be possible to alleviate the suffering of the entire world around us in this lifetime. We have to do what we can to address that as best as we are able to, and then also keep developing our own minds, our own qualities, transcending our limitations. Again, that's the name of this course because it's about kind of keep moving beyond what we currently see as our limits. But recognize too, though, that we have to be clear about what we're trying to do here. These are about developing our minds, perfecting our minds, and not removing the harm that happens to beings in the world, removing the poverty that exists in our world through our generosity. Okay, I think that's clear. I just wanted to reiterate that because when we see these sorts of things, we think, well, wow, I could spend my whole life, dealing with all 11 of these, right? There are people around us right now who need all of these things, who without a doubt would benefit from our doing that for them in the moment. But is that the wisest way to spend this life? For some of us, it may be. Like I said, each of us has to go through our own internal investigation. But if you do dedicate your life to helping others, as I said, do that with bodhicitta motivation, that you're not just helping one being. Just like I said last week, when you're feeding birds, don't think you're just feeding the 20 or 30 birds that come and eat that grain. Think that you're doing it with bodhicitta, so all beings will benefit. Let's talk a little bit about what, in some presentations, these are called kind of the factors or causes that give rise to not having good ethical discipline, not having good ethical behavior. Here I'm going to call them the hindrances to ethics, similar to what we saw for generosity, but these are not on your chart. These actually come from the section of the Lam Rim that pertains to the middle scope. Remember how I said morality is the first of the 3 higher trainings. Well, what blocks our practice of morality there will also block our practice of morality in the great scope, in the bodhisattva practice. The first one, not knowing the precepts of ethical conduct, not being aware of what it means to engage in it, which is what we're learning tonight and what we've learned through turning our awareness towards the 3 scopes of the Lam Rim and the teachings to give us a good idea of what good morality and ethical behavior looks like on each of the 3 levels. Carelessness with little regard for ethical behavior, we just aren't heeding the advice. We're getting very careless in our way of behaving in the world. Third, having no respect for the precepts of ethical conduct. We hear them, but we don't have the respect that they should be afforded so that they become a guiding principle in our lives. And then fourth, having various afflictions that become problematic. Let's talk about each of these a little bit more. The antidote to this, where we don't know the precepts, is of course to study and contemplate teachings on ethical conduct, which clearly delineate which actions are beneficial and which are harmful. Now, as I said earlier, in terms of the lower scope, you have those basic behaviors, the 10 non-virtuous actions that we want to avoid, the 10 virtuous that we want to engage in. We need to understand those clearly, know when we are engaging in them, when we are not. Be very clear about what they are and not be unaware of them. Otherwise, like we've been doing in countless lifetimes, we've been unaware of the causes of our suffering and continuing to engage in them wholeheartedly, even with great enthusiasm. So knowing what are the precepts is the first step always. Now, why I'm taking a little more time on this is because I also want to point out that knowing what is a transgression of our vows is really important. I think some of you have attended some of the classes I've done on vows, and Venerable Robina has taught on vows a number of times. And there was a period where she was coming here and she wanted me to teach on the Bodhisattva vows and what are transgressions of them and what have you. It's a really in-depth thing. I mean, there's a little booklet by FPMT on Bodhisattva vows, for example. The 5 lay vows are pretty straightforward, even though I still do get questions occasionally on those, but hopefully you got questions answered when you took them from your preceptor and are clear about what it means to break them. But essentially with the Bodhisattva vows, you have 18 root transgressions and you have 46 secondary vows. By the way, when I taught this Transcending Our Limitations for TNL, with each of these 6 perfections, I went through their respective portion of the 46 secondary. The 46 secondary are set out in 7 categories. The first 6 are related to each of the 6 perfections. And then you have the last 10 or so. I'm sorry, the first 6 of these 7, the last 10 or so of the 46 are in that 7th category, which is how we keep from make sure that we do benefit others and so on. It's kind of that mentality that we bring into those. But the 46 secondary vows are in these 7 categories, the 6 perfections and the need to benefit others with our actions. So if you don't study those, and a lot of people may study the root vows, but they don't really study the secondary vows. Secondary vows are incredibly important. We have to know what they are. We have to know what it means to transgress them. If you need further guidance on this and are interested in pursuing teachings that I've given on them, know that there's an entire set of teachings at archive.org, where a lot of the audio recordings from the older days at TNL. I think most of the TNL stuff is posted at YouTube now because it's all video. But the audio teachings I gave some years ago after Venerable Robina said, you need to teach on the Bodhisattva vows again. It was, I don't know how many sessions, and it's an entire set of audio teachings that goes through Tsongkhapa's advice about when we are breaking them and what are the various factors involved. What is the state of mind that we have to have? So we understand when we are and when we are not breaking those, not so that we can kind of get away with it by changing one factor, but that we have that knowledge of when we've crossed the line, when we've actually committed something, so that we purify it and moreover keep from crossing that line through our reinforcement of this first idea. We have to know what the precepts are. Then when you get to the tantric vows, which I've also taught on, but it was teachings that are not in the public domain because they're for people who've had highest yoga tantric empowerment. Most people these days, if you have the good fortune of getting a highest yoga tantra empowerment, which are fairly rare, especially nowadays with COVID and people not assembling for those sorts of events. If you have the good fortune of getting one, oftentimes they give you the vows as part of that, but they give you no instruction as to what it means to hold the vows because the Lama, the person who conducted the empowerment, is off to another location. And so again, know that there are some resources out there, written resources that can help. But it's very important that we don't just say, oh, well, I took the vows, but nobody explained them to me, so I'll just do whatever. I'll do the best that I can. No, it's your responsibility to learn them, to know what is breaking the vows, what is a transgression of a secondary vow or a branch vow, what have you, and then to uphold that. So this is the first point. Why we don't have good morality and why we keep stepping in it is because we haven't done our study and our contemplation on what true ethical conduct looks like. What are the actions that we need to engage in and those that we need to refrain from? And again, especially with regard to vows. The antidote to carelessness, this heedlessness that we have, where we just don't have that great of regard for our ethical behavior. We're like, well, yeah, I know I'm supposed to do that, but I just really don't care. Well, you need mindfulness, non-forgetfulness. You need to make sure that you are being mindful of how you want to be in the world, the behaviors that you do want to refrain from, that you make sure that don't come into your mind, and then the ones that you do want to adhere to, the virtuous thoughts and what have you, that you do have them. Mindfulness is the factor that is in our minds all whenever we're engaged in an object, but it's essentially our holding on to it, not forgetting it. Introspective awareness or introspection is the ability to check in occasionally to make sure that we are moving in the right direction, to make sure that we aren't going astray. We need to really strengthen those in our minds so that we don't become careless. And then the two that were on that list of the 11 virtuous mental factors that I showed a little while ago, and I said I was going to talk about them. These are the terms I like to use for them, but you may see them referred to in the terms in parentheses there. The first one being self-respect, or sometimes called shame, which I don't think is a really good English translation, but I'll talk about that in a moment. And then the other one is consideration for others, or embarrassment. Let's talk about both of those. Essentially, what we're saying is that this carelessness that we have, how do we rectify that? The first one is where we have this really high regard for our own ideals of how we'd like to be in the world. We've all studied Buddhism. We know what it's like to kind of keep the containment of our behavior so that we don't transgress even just the basic ways of being in the world and not harming others through the 10 non-virtues and what have you. Well, we need to have an inner guide that says, I'm going to uphold this because I care about myself. I care about how I want to be in the world and how I want to be towards others. The second one, which we call, again, consideration for others or embarrassment, is the idea that we need to think about how others would be influenced by our misbehavior. Not just those that become the object of our lying or slander or whatever it is that we engage in, but moreover, what damage does this do to our teachers, for example, in a sense, because our teachers want us to abide by this. And here we are as their students going off in another direction. Well, it's kind of an insult and a slap in the face to our teachers. And if they were to watch us at that time, you can even imagine for this second factor, what if Lama Zopa was right there in front of you? What if His Holiness the Dalai Lama was right there in front of you? Would you engage in that behavior? Well, no, because you know that it would have a negative reflection on them as well. And moreover, we want to try to do what we can to assure that there's no damage to them and their reputation and the Dharma itself as well. So here's where we kind of think about others. The first one, self-respect, we think about me and how I want to uphold behavior that I find is helpful and beneficial for myself and others. But then we also look at how others would be impacted. I always talk about how when I first became a teacher, and of course, you don't have to be a teacher to have this sort of mindset, obviously. I should have had it prior to this. But I realized when I moved to Santa Fe here and I was a teacher at the center, kind of one of the main people that people will remember if they come to a center or, have some contact with, that I needed to be really careful how I was when I was out at Whole Foods or, shopping or doing whatever, driving, because you don't want to have this negative perspective for somebody so that when they see you again, or if they know who you are, then they think ill of not just you, but TNL and FPMT and maybe His Holiness and the Dharma. If somebody, for example, if I were to be in the parking lot at Whole Foods and I got into an argument with somebody and said a lot of unpleasant things I shouldn't say to them, and then they happen to walk in the door at TNL, I'd be really, they go, oh, there's that horrible person that was in the parking lot at Whole Foods that said all these mean things to me. Why do I want to stay here? Why do I even want to be involved in Buddhism? So that we can think that way, that every being that we meet, we don't want to create some sort of negative energy with that can have an unfavorable impact on them in this lifetime and can certainly create some sort of obstacles in the future. So again, those are the factors that if we go back to the screen, these are all the things that help us to get out of our sort of careless little regard for what we want to ideally engage in, is to have those two, thinking about self-respect and then having consideration for others. Trepidation is on the list. Trepidation, or some sort of apprehension or fear of the consequences of our actions, might be really powerful in the beginning, certainly with the small scope, the person of the least capacity, because there we're thinking about the unfavorable rebirths that we might have on the basis of our not having good ethical behavior. But there can even be other levels of trepidation or fear, because we can also, of course, fear on the middle scope, our continuing cycling from life to life. But even on the great scope, we have some trepidation about how others are going to have to suffer. As I pointed out earlier, every moment that we are in an unenlightened state is another moment that other beings suffer, because we're not capable of helping them to the greatest degree. So we should have some level of trepidation, if you will, some sort of misgivings that we have about engaging in faulty behavior or not engaging in the most virtuous behavior, because we even fear the consequences that will happen to others on the basis of that, much less ourselves. And this is, again, is the Bodhisattva perspective, is to try to look at it from, if I really am confident that bodhicitta and this path to enlightenment is the way out of here to be able to benefit all beings, well, then I should want my behavior to accord with that, because that will be what helps me to get to that goal and to be able to help others. And I actually have some trepidation that not only will I have to continue to suffer if I continue to engage in unskillful behavior, but others will have to suffer as well. That really helps us to deepen our compassion. We don't know the consequences of our inaction or our faulty action in regard to ourselves. Often we're blind to it, but we are often even more blind in regard to the consequences to others. His Holiness often talks about how we should hold that regard, that there are beings in this world whose enlightenment depends on you. Each of you have beings that, due to the karmic connections that you have, like, for example, your parents and siblings and people that you're close to that I don't know, right? I don't have any karmic connection. I might have a karmic connection with you, but I don't have a karmic connection with the people who you have karmic connections with. Maybe their enlightenment depends on you becoming a Buddha. Well, I mean, it's a pretty heavy burden to put on us, right? Wow, I got to become enlightened for all those beings. But that's what we're talking about. We want to have an impetus to move in that direction, to have some trepidation about what will ensue if we don't become a Buddha, if we don't practice wholeheartedly, if we don't refrain from misbehavior and engage in virtuous actions. So that's a factor that gets us off our butt, and stops us from being so careless as well. So again, these are hard to hear because they do sound sometimes a bit more like a stick than they sound like a carrot, but nonetheless, the carrot's there too. You do have a much more peaceful mind if you do follow this, as we're going to see with regard to some of the points coming up. Number 3, having no respect for the precepts of ethical conduct. Well, the antidote is to cultivate respect for, first of all, the Buddha who taught this system of ethics. Again, study up on what it means to be a Buddha, on the qualities that a Buddha has through the teachings in the Refuge section of the Lamrim. Really gain confidence that the Buddha is this infallible being who has his perfect knowledge, who gave us out of his compassion and kindness an understanding of this system of ethics based on karma. And we can then also develop respect by watching and observing those practitioners who observe good ethical behavior with great care and be inspired by them. Develop greater respect for the Dharma of ethical behavior itself by virtue of looking at those who are practicing it and seeing the amazing results that they have in their lives. The ordained folks who are holding their vows so purely, as well as lay practitioners who are adopting a much more serious orientation towards their ethical behavior. That's how we change that. And then the last one, why do we have problems in engaging in ethical behavior? Of course, this might be the most obvious one. We have a lot of afflictions. The antidote is to examine your mind to determine which afflictions predominate. They always say to start there. Start with the largest ones, the greatest ones first. And then make great effort to apply appropriate antidotes, cultivating the qualities that counteract them and working hard to eliminate them eventually. Of course, we eliminate all the afflictions through the wisdom realizing emptiness. But in terms of just this level of engaging in good morality, we have to have counterforces. And I'm sure all of you have studied the antidotes to the afflictions, and you know that, for example, when we have strong attachment arising, that we need to counter it with thoughts such as seeing the unfavorable aspects of that object of attachment. So we stop overlaying and exaggerating all the positive qualities, also seeing the impermanence of that object. No matter how desirable and delicious and delightful that object is, it's just a transitory experience in this life. Nothing we can take with us, nothing that has any lasting impact. So again, there are many antidotes to the afflictions. I won't go through them all. Next week, when we talk about patience, we're going to go into how to work with anger and how to diminish that particular affliction that can be problematic in much of our non-virtuous behavior. So again, whatever afflictions predominate in your own mind, sort that out and then try to actively engage in the antidotes to those. I almost have to pause and take a breath. We've covered a lot of stuff already tonight in terms of all the things that, influence our practice of good ethical behavior. So once more, do what you can to adopt what you can of all of this. I want to very briefly touch on the benefits of ethics. It obviously is the main cause for what we call high status, having a good rebirth within samsara. If you don't engage in good morality, you can never create the causes for another human rebirth like this one. Secondly, it provides the ground or the foundation for both the path of individual liberation, attaining that, and enlightenment, because of course, as I said, it's the foundation from which we engage in concentration, wisdom. All of those are a part of the path for both one's own liberation as well as enlightenment, Buddhahood. It also brings immediate benefits. This is what I was alluding to earlier. You feel lighter, happier, more peaceful. And then you also, have less problems with others. We don't have so much conflict with others because we're not the agitator for them and influencing them in a negative way. It's also, of course, the best preparation for a fearless death. So when we get to death, we will know that we've used this life well and that we've created the causes for a good rebirth to follow. The ways to practice this perfection, again, on the chart that's talked about, I'll just pull it up really quickly. The same things that were there for the generosity, perfection of generosity. Oops, I didn't put it on the screen. I have to do the share screen thing again. Oops, there it is. Okay. These are, again, similar to what was on generosity, and you're going to see the same things presented for every one of these 6 perfections. These are things that you can bring to bear. But I want to emphasize the very first of these in terms of the 3 supreme qualities: supreme reliance. Rely on bodhicitta purely as your motivation for practicing ethics. The other ones you can read through and find some additional advice. But it's so important. Again, these are practices of a bodhisattva or a bodhisattva wannabe, such as, many of us are. We're not card-carrying bodhisattvas yet, but we're on our way to achieving that. We should bring bodhicitta motivation into all of our practice of ethical behavior. So it's really important that we do that with our generosity. As I said, when we're feeding the birds in the yard, we don't make it just about those birds, we make it about all beings being the beneficiary of those acts of generosity. When we engage in refraining from negative actions, engaging in virtuous deeds, benefiting other beings, whatever type of ethical behavior we're involved in, do it with bodhicitta. And just to solidify that, I'm going to share just a few more slides that are some quotes from Rinpoche in that book. Oh, I'm sorry, these aren't from Rinpoche. I forgot, I took these from Geshe Sopa. There's some wonderful quotes in the book by Rinpoche, but I liked what Geshe Sopa says on this. This is in his 3rd volume that pertains to the perfection of ethical discipline or ethics. Bodhicitta is the root of ethical discipline. It is the supreme way to safeguard pure ethical conduct. Why? because bodhicitta by its very nature is the best way to avoid harming others, right? If we have the mind of bodhicitta, it's only about benefiting them. How could we ever harm somebody if we go into all of our acts of being in the world, being with others, talking to them? If we have bodhicitta, then we're guaranteed that we won't harm them. Tsongkhapa therefore advises us to develop bodhicitta. If we have it, he says, we should not let it degenerate, and we should try to increase it as much as possible. So we see that in the end, the best way to safeguard our behavior to a large degree is to have bodhicitta in our hearts. Of course, that means every day doing what we can to cultivate that mind, to be mindful of it throughout our day. And this, what I said last week and this week are both pertaining to this whole idea of what Rinpoche calls bodhicitta mindfulness. If we bring bodhicitta into all of our actions, we imbue them with special power, but we keep our mind in a virtuous state where thoughts of harming them can't arise. You know, if I have this mind of bodhicitta when I'm out and about in the world, how could I say something negative to somebody if I think that that being is who I want to become a Buddha for, is somebody who I have compassion and love for, and who I want to achieve their greatest happiness and their greatest well-being, their complete freedom from suffering? Well, then how could I harm them? How could I inflict harm on them if I've protected my mind with bodhicitta? So if you boil down everything we talked about tonight, maybe that little quote from Geshe Sopa is the essence of it, that if we live our lives with a desire to benefit others to the greatest degree, then we will refrain from harming them, and we will do virtuous deeds towards them, and we will benefit them without a doubt. So maybe it's already time for class to end, but are there any questions from tonight or comments on anything I've said? It's been a lot of words, I realize, but. Okay, so again, I will have that handout forwarded on, make sure that it goes out to everyone, as well as the slides, the PDF of the slides, so that you can take a look at those. And I know you've gotten, as I said earlier, a whole list of things that you kind of look at and go, oh my gosh, you know, Don's talked about this, but now he just talked about generosity a week ago. I'm just barely getting my head around that. Now I've got this ethical discipline to look at. Again, don't feel like you have to practice all of this immediately, but you might still look over tonight and think of one thing. What's the one thing I can do that will change, begin change and process in the opposite direction, or continuing in the direction that you're going? And I'm guessing that all of you are already moving in that direction of following the Buddha's precepts on ethical behavior. But what's the one thing now that you could do that would take it to another degree, transcend your own limitations that currently exist with regard to where you sort of gotten stuck or where you feel like you aren't progressing any further? Where can you push the envelope a little bit, as they say? All right, if there are no questions, then I'm going to go ahead and pull up the prayers and we can do our dedication. And just as we did dedication with the idea of generosity, we can do it also with the idea of ethical conduct. That this is kind of part of our using our bodies, our speech, all of our thoughts in the most meaningful way to benefit others, through having these thoughts of loving kindness and compassion towards others and wanting them to benefit from everything we do. All of our actions that are indirectly affecting them as well as directly affecting them. And we dedicate with that spirit of these perfections as we recite these words. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. And the prayers for our very precious teachers, seeing that they are our guides on our path, and they are the guides for so many beings in this world, especially His Holiness, who plays such a prominent role in this world. We really want these beings to stay in this world as guiding lights for us and others on a path to well-being. And may that happen through the virtue of what we've done here tonight. And so as we recite this for these three teachers, extend this out for all spiritual guides so they all have good health and long lives. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And then for Osahita Lama Yeshe's reincarnation, Venerable One, to you whose kindness exceeds that of all the conquerors, for those wanderers in far-off places, especially the West, mindful of your loving concern for us in intentionally descending again into a family of a far distant land, we make this request. O Lama, please, please live long. Then dedicate, as usual, for all those beings that you're holding in your heart right now, while we want everyone to benefit from what we've done here tonight. As I was saying earlier, there are those beings who we kind of have a karmic connection with, who might be the most immediate beneficiaries of our deeds and our actions, and eventually our becoming a Buddha. So we think about them, those beings that we know, whose situation moves us right now, who are experiencing obstacles, who are experiencing illness. Perhaps we know those who are dying or who have died recently. And we think of them very strongly and think that without a doubt they receive the benefit of what we've done here tonight. It helps them to be free immediately from all their suffering and to have all the causes that will help them to attain true peace and happiness. And may this be so for all beings through what we've done here tonight. So again, next week,